So after a couple of weeks of comments, I think the results are in on what I should do with the Steampunk Regen. And I think it comes down to a compromise of not going against the spirit of the design and keeping the outside as original as possible, trying to keep with period components, but to attempt to bring in some best practices on regenerative receivers that would have been known at the time. Okay, I'm not going to use any modern techniques here. I'm going to use techniques that the builder could have obtained from the literature of the 20s and early 30s, and we'll try to tame the beast. Now you saw how this thing acts. There's some outright mistakes in the schematic, and I think that we can do justice to this receiver and bring it into a little more functional, practical type of operation as regens go. Before I begin to do these fixes and describe them, I think we need a general regenerative receiver best practices video. So let's look at some of the secrets of regens, and this is a very serious discussion. It's so serious, in fact, that I took Bert's advice and I got a fairly radical haircut so as to present a more karma-rich environment to describe regens, because we're really talking about history, we're talking about philosophy here, the religion of regenerative receivers, and I need to take this a little bit more seriously. So we're going into the deep, deep recesses of regen lore, and we're going to try to ferret out all of these things that you've been learning over the years. Remember, when regens started to come about in the teens, many people were arguing over who really invented regeneration. You know, we think it's Armstrong, we think it's Meissner, Langmuir, you know, all of these all these people were working with valves at the time. Who really got the thing oscillating and regenerating? But I would contend that the problem was not making them oscillate, the problem was keeping them from oscillating, because we have seen, especially with this regenerative receiver, it wants to take off and make all kinds of noise. So in this video, let's go over some of the fundamentals of regenerative receivers and see if we can then apply them to this mid-30s steampunk style regen. Okay, before I get deep into negative resistance territory, let's consider a simple crystal set or maybe a grid leak detector with no feedback applied. Of course, everyone concentrates on the coil losses. Coils are inherently lossy compared to an almost perfect component. The air or vacuum variable capacitor is close to a perfect component. Losses include series resistance, skin effect losses, and even the capacitance between the turns. These are reactive losses in the coil. And the proximity of the coil to things around it, you know, how you mount the coil, how close it is to lossy materials such as metal, these all affect the losses in the coil. If I could somehow make a coil with no losses and pair it with a perfect tuning capacitor, the only thing causing loss would be the loading effects of the detector itself and the antenna. My crystal set detector and my antenna could present a combined 10K ohm load to that perfect tuned circuit we created. So, for example, let's say we had a coil of about 100 microhenries. That's something like 60 or 70 turns on a 2-inch diameter form, and a 365 picofarad variable capacitor. This combination at full mesh puts us down around 830 kilohertz, right in the middle of the broadcast band. And yes, this is a little small to cover the band, so you might want 90 or 100 turns to cover the whole band. The Q would be about 20 with this 10K worth of combined loading on the coil. So with that Q and that loading, we have a bandwidth of around 40 kilohertz. Now we know that AM stations are 10 kilohertz wide, and in some localities this might be fine, as you might have 3 strong stations that your crystal set can receive, and they're all well separated in frequency, so you can tune in all 3 with no difficulty. Now if we replace the crystal detector with an FET or valve grid leak or infinite impedance detector, and we have a well-coupled long wire antenna, perhaps we can improve our combined loading effect to say 50,000 ohms of loading compared to 10K load of loading with the crystal set. So our Q goes up. It goes up to almost 100. This reduces the bandwidth of our tuned circuit to a little under 10,000 or 8,300 hertz, which is just about perfect for good AM fidelity, and you get some moderate station selectivity. So you get the idea. The performance of our set is governed by the losses incurred by the detector type and the antenna loading almost as much as the tuned circuit's quality. This does not stop folks from attempting to design as low loss as possible inductors for the crystal sets. So we note that there is a slight peaking effect with the higher Q, and the peaking effect gives us more recovered audio. But I want even more sensitivity and selectivity than I can afford with either the crystal set or the grid leak detector. How can I deal with the loss factors beyond making the tuned circuit as perfect as possible and optimizing the antenna and detector loading? Well, of course, I could add more tuned stages and obtain cascade selectivity and sensitivity benefits. This is basically the secret behind those 1920s TRFs and later the superheterodynes. But before we make the jump into TRFs and superhets, let's consider regenerative feedback. This regen feedback effect was discovered in the mid-teens, early 20th century. It was observed that positive feedback could produce an effect that negated those circuit and environmental losses, antenna loading, coil losses, proximity losses, and detector loading. We call this ability to cancel out those resistive and proximity losses with the addition of power into the tuned circuit, negative resistance injection. Negative resistance injection, as with positive feedback and regenerative receivers, is a different animal from a negative resistance component, a component that has a natural negative resistance property. Tunnel diode is a negative resistance device with negative resistance properties. And this negative resistance property is uncommon because it defies Ohm's law. We know that in Ohm's law, as we increase the voltage, the current increases in a resistive circuit. Doesn't obey Ohm's law. Okay, before you go wild, Ohm's law works for resistive or ohmic circuits, but it does not hold for nonlinear circuits in devices such as, diodes, transistors, and vacuum tubes. And it does not especially hold for negative resistance devices such as tunnel diodes and dynatron circuits. These circuits actually start out increasing current with increasing applied voltage, just like a regular diode would. But then suddenly, along the forward conduction curve, they decide to decrease current with increasing voltage. This is pretty odd behavior. We know that this effect can be taken advantage of if we bias a device such that it oscillates through this nonlinear flipping area of the curve. This is similar to a relaxation oscillator with an Ne2 bulb. So the two-terminal oscillator or amplifier becomes feasible with a negative resistance circuit or device. So now that we know all about negative resistance devices, what have these got to do with the positive feedback regeneration deal? Well, nothing really. It's basically just to confuse us. Some engineer or scientist said that the application of positive feedback
really has the same effect of defying Ohm's law by forcing AC losses towards zero, increasing conductivity and so on. And they thought it would be cute just to call it negative resistance. And yes, this is also the principle of Q multiplication and even active filters. This doesn't mean that you can ignore the inductor or coil completely. The DC losses of the coil, the winding capacitance effects, power supply noise, the physical stability of the coil, coupling mismatches, for instance, cannot be totally corrected by simply adding more feedback. So we still need very good coils to get optimum performance in regenerative receivers. So the next question is, how do we control the feedback so as to get the proper amount of injection, proper amount of negative resistance for a CW, a single sideband, or an AM signal? And this leads us to the question, what is the so-called sweet spot where we get the best performance in our regenerative receiver?
So you go on the website and do that and give them your credit card and everything. And so I'll probably end up seeing that. Hopefully by the end of the week they'll put it, they'll have it in the mail and all of that good stuff. So that could be a good thing. So as the days go on, we're getting ready, trying to get and yeah, that's about it. Back at you, and maybe others. KC2CKO K2XAM.
K2XAM, KC2CKO. Yes, I just got my tickets in the mail the other day, but I sent away for about a month ago.
So this is an early 30s regen. This is a project I did probably 15, maybe 20 years ago. It uses a pair of Type 76 triodes, which are early 30s triodes. They do have a cathode, so that's different than the Type 30 battery tube used in the Steampunk Scotty Regen. It's built on a wooden base, but it has a nice metal front cover, and it has a vernier, just like the Steampunk receiver has. So this is a similar receiver. It does not have plug-in coils, so it's a little more stable. Now this uses the reaction control that you're all familiar with, which is a single variable capacitor from the plate circuit to ground. Let's listen to how it goes into reaction. It's not bad. A little bit abrupt. But you'll notice, even at full reaction, there's no place where it squeals or howls or goes crazy. It's a stable regen. Now I'm in autodyne now. That means it's oscillating, so it can handle CW. Now this radio can also handle AM and single sideband. Let's go up band a little bit.
So it turned out you could go back and forth between them, and it was fascinating hearing all the communications going on.
Now the receiver also has a coupling link, a coupling control.
I pretty much go more to see everybody socialize.
Everybody talking about Nearfest coming up pretty soon here in New Hampshire. So looking down at the R29 Regen, it uses a lift link system for the input coupling. Of course, as you let off on the coupling, you have to let off on the regeneration as well. The more coupling to the antenna, obviously, you have to add in order to get the negative resistance into the coil from the extra loading from the antenna. You'd like the frequency to not change markedly when you increase coupling. You'd like the frequency to not change markedly when you add reaction as well. So those are two important things when you're designing a regen. And scoring regens on those 2 points alone, your antenna coupling and your reaction, Does the frequency go flying, or is it fairly stable as you introduce each? Fairly standard and a similar system. It uses an interstage transformer to the output. Of course, it does have an output transformer where our system goes directly to the headphones on the Steampunk Scotty Regen. But this is a very, very similar receiver, and it has much higher performance. So let me describe this mid-century two-tube Regen. This is a 40-meter single-band ham receiver. It uses a 6SJ7 pentode in the Regen stage, followed by a 6J5 triode headphone amplifier. I have that going into a single-tube speaker amplifier. It's a Type 45, biased at -3 volts with about 150 volts on the plate. So that brings it up to the level where it can drive a speaker fairly easily. This Regen uses the screen grid control, putting voltage on the screen grid to affect the reaction or the positive feedback. And it has an input coupling control, which is a lift link loop on the antenna connection. It's really pointed toward the CW band, so it covers 7 megahertz to about 7.2 megahertz. And you'll hear it does a fairly good job on sideband and a good job on CW. So let's look specifically at the Regen control and how we get into the autodyne position so that we can pick up CW. Let's take a listen. Let's bring up the coupling a little bit. Now when I bring up the coupling, I have to increase the regeneration to go back in autodyne. Now notice the background noise came up because I'm coupled tighter. Now you'll also notice if I go beyond the most sensitive point, it does not stop working. And in fact, when you go beyond the sweet spot, you'll have the ability to pick up stronger stations without overloading the detector. That sweet spot occurs not only when you're doing AM stations, which you might be more used to, but it also occurs when you're in autodyne. Tighten the coupling more. We're more sensitive. The background noises come up, and we had to advance the regeneration in order to take care of that antenna loading. The increased antenna loading required that we had to advance the regeneration control.
Victor, Mike Victor. Oscar, Mexico, Victoria, please, Victor Echo. Okay, Roger, I got it. Victor, America, Curie, Oscar, Mike Victor, 591774.
Hey man, I hope not, because up here we had a storm. The guys coming back from Buffalo there were broke down in it, but they got
Even though this is calibrated for the 40-meter band, I decreased the band set control to give it higher frequency so we can pick up a shortwave station. So let's increase the regen.
donde vamos a establecer la comunicación ahí en la capital espiritual con los periodistas independientes a la hora de para matizar pues la situación de este planteamiento que ha estado.
So as you can hear, it's capable of very good zero beat reception.
Hay que cerrar filas desde fábricas hasta
See, we're in oscillation.
hasta que no se eliminen la blandinguería, así lo calificó él mismo,
Okay.
ante las cosas que
Very
pasan,
well behaved
no se
on
hagan los
AM.
análisis profundos.
Okay, there's no doubt that this receiver is a good performer, and it has a few tricks up its sleeve. If I had to score this as purely a ham radio regen for 40 meters, I'd probably say it's about an 8 out of 10. We can do better than this. It's a fully shielded regen. It uses metal tubes, which are shielded. It has a vernier control on the main tuning. It's got the coupling input. So there's a lot going for this regen. Let's take a look inside. So first of all, let's focus on the input coupling, which many of you are probably curious about. That's over here. That's this loop. Can you see the single loop? The single loop goes right into the antenna connection. I have a little filter there that's set up to give some extra protection, you know, below 40 meters. So basically it's a high-pass filter that I've installed. We're not interested in anything below 7 megahertz, so I put in a filter that takes care of anything that might happen up front in there. So there's something you can add. Then it goes into the, okay, see how the coupling link works? Now there's a flaw here. I can't completely uncouple it. It hits the side of the chassis. That's a flaw. And as we get closer, we have maximum coupling. I'll let you hear that. See how that works? Main tuning, you can see it's just a capacitor directly off the vernier, and the band set looks like it's a 100 picofarad trimmer. So also you notice there's this funny shield that's in between the lift link loop, which is the input coupling, and the main tuning on the coil. This is the ground end of the coil, the purple wire. The tap is up a couple of turns. The whole thing is secured with some epoxy, and then the hot end is on the far side. So when you're adjusting the link, you're adjusting to the cold end, and you have a Faraday shield between the two. Again, that prevents capacitive coupling between those two, which would encourage out-of-band signals, especially broadcast band and strong shortwave stations, from spoiling the performance of the receiver. So there it is. You got to look at the naughty bits in the receiver. I hope this shows, you know, a 1940s style regen would look like. Dual pentode or pentode triode type receivers were very popular in the 40s and probably through the mid-50s as novice receivers, because it was easy for the Elmer and the novice to put something like this together, and you'd have a very pleasant receiver for 40 meters. Now, things become more difficult when you start to deal with plug-in coils. Plug-in coils, by their nature, are not going to have the stability that a fixed coil like this can have. And usually you'll be fooling around a little more with the plug-in coil to get the kind of stability we've seen on this receiver.
I know some of you may be a little disappointed because I'm not covering simple hobby type regens here. Because the Steampunk Regen, the little Scotty Regen, is a ham receiver, I've been limiting this to higher performance ham style regen discussions. And you saw two fairly well behaved regens, one from the early 30s and one in the more modern 1940s through 50s style. These were working on 80 and 40 meters. Both were not perfect, but certainly we can get some great ideas on how to tame the Steampunk receiver from these. What are the characteristics that separate a toy regen from a good regen from a really excellent regen? Here's a few of the characteristics that we strive for. Sensitivity and selectivity, ease of tuning, feedback stability. That means no howling or motorboating or ultrasonic super regeneration, which is sometimes called squegging. Smoothness of entering the reaction sweet spot for AM, CW, and single sideband. Lack of hum. Lack of frequency pulling with strong signals. Lack of frequency pulling with the regen setting. Holding a zero beat for synchronous detection, phase locking. Low distortion and good fidelity. And I've also saved the best discussion for last. Let's talk about reaction control methods. And I'm going to go from the worst to the best. Okay, this may be very judgmental on my part, but see if you agree on some of these reaction methods as being better than others. So on that same theme of trying to keep the detector from oscillating that we spoke of before, the earliest reaction throttle types were usually simple resistors inserted into the grid or plate circuit to deliberately lower the feedback through swamping or attenuation. This led to resistive methods being applied to the plate and grid, with series and parallel methods both being investigated. These methods were inefficient since they caused signal loss and they generally broadened the response of the regen. Next, the tune plate, tune grid regenerative receiver, using a variometer in the plate to control the regeneration. This was the earliest Armstrong circuit to actually be produced in commercial quantities, both by Adams Morgan, including the Paragon, the Greeby receivers, and many others between 1916 and 1922 used the tune plate, tune grid style regen with variometers. After World War I, the standard tickler method that we all now call Armstrong was finally known by amateurs, but it did not gain popularity in the production and commercial units until the early 20s. The transatlantic test regen that was carried by Godley to Scotland in 1921, along with that homemade super heterodyne, he also brought a regen, and it was the tune plate, tune grid style regen with variometer feedback, not a tickler type. When the tickler did arrive, it was the vario coupler style that was the most popular. This is still one of the most excellent methods of throttling your regen, and it allows between 90 and up to 180 degrees of control. The variable capacitor throttle, which is very popular, kind of comes next on the scene. The standard throttle capacitor to ground has 3 or 4 variations. If you include the differential throttle, which you people probably don't know a lot about, you may have been exposed to one of these 4 methods, but let's look at them. I am leaving out the screen grid control method that we saw on the Pentode regen, since this is not really applicable on this Steampunk receiver. But as you heard, it's quite effective. Everyone can agree that the simple series potentiometer method used in the original Steampunk Scotty Regen, it's kind of crude, it's not proving out to be a great system for the triode. In the next video, let's see what we can do using all these things we've learned about regens and see if we can bring the Scotty Regen and maybe its plug-in coils back into better operation on the 40 and the 80 meter band.